I am a refugee, an asylum seeker. These are not simple words, even if habit of hearing them makes them seem so. I arrived at Gatwick Airport in the late afternoon of November 23rd last year. It is a familiar minor climax in our stories, leaving what we know and arriving in strange places, carrying little bits of jumbled luggage and suppressing secret and garbled ambitions. For some, as for me, it was the first journey by air and the first arrival in a place so monumental as an airport, though I have traveled by sea and by land, and in my imagination. I walked slowly through what felt like coldly lit and silent empty tunnels, though now, on reflection, I know I walked past rows of seats and large glass windows, and signs and instructions. Tunnels. The streaming darkness outside lashing with fine rain, and the light inside drawing me in. What we know constantly reels us into our ignorance, makes us see the world as if we were still squatting in that shallow, tepid pool which we had known since childhood terrors. I walked slowly, surprised at every anxious turn that an instruction awaited to tell me where to go. I walked slowly so that I would not miss a turning or misread a sign, so that I would not attract attention too early by getting into a flutter of confusion. They took me away at the passport desk. Passport? The man said, after I had been standing in front of him for a moment too long, waiting to be found out, to be arrested. His face looked stern, even though the blankness in his eyes was intended to give nothing away. I had been told not to say anything, to pretend I could not speak any English. I was not sure why, but I knew I would do as I was told, because the advice had a crafty ring to it, the kind of resourceful ruse the powerless would know. They will ask you your name and your father's name, and what good you had done in your life. Say nothing. When he said passport a second time, I handed it over, wincing in anticipation of abuse and threats. I was used to officials who glared and spluttered at you for the smallest mishap, who toyed with you and humiliated you for the sheer pleasure of wielding their hallowed authority. So I expected the immigration hamel behind his little podium to register something, to snarl or shake his head, to look up slowly and stare at me with the blaze of assurance with which the fortunate regard the supplicant. But he looked up from leafing through my joke document with a look of suppressed joy in his eyes, like a fisherman who has just felt a tug on the line. No entry visa. Then he picked up his phone and spoke into it for a moment, smiling openly now. He asked me to wait on one side. I stood with my eyes lowered, so I did not see the approach of the man who took me away for questioning. He called me by name and smiled as I looked up, a friendly, worldly smile which said with some assurance, "Why don't you come with me so we can sort out this little problem?" As he strode briskly ahead of me, I saw that he was overweight and looked unhealthy, and by the time we reached an interview room, he was breathing heavily and tugging at his shirt. He sat in a chair and immediately shifted uncomfortably in it, and I thought of him as someone sweatily trapped in a form he disliked. It made me fear that his distemper would indispose him towards me, but then he smiled again, and was soft-spoken and polite. We were in a small, windowless room with a hard floor, with a table between us and a bench running along one wall. It was lit with hard fluorescent strips which made the pewter-colored walls closing out of the corner of my eyes. He told me his name was Kevin Edelman, pointing to the badge he wore on his jacket. "May God give you health, Kevin Eldman." He smiled again, smiling a lot, perhaps because he could see my nervousness despite my best efforts and wished to reassure me. Or perhaps in his work it was unavoidable that he should take pleasure at the discomfort of those who came before him. He had a pad of yellow paper in front of him, and he wrote in it for a moment or two, taking down the name from my joke passport before he spoke to me. "May I see your ticket, please?" "Ticket? Oh, yes." "I see you have baggage," he said, pointing. "Your baggage identification tag." I played dumb. You might know ticket without speaking English, but baggage identification tag seemed advanced. "I'll have the baggage collected for you," he said, keeping the ticket beside his notepad. Then he smiled again, interrupting himself from saying more on the subject. A long face, a bit fleshy in the temples, especially then as he smiled. Perhaps he was only smiling in anticipation of the mixed pleasure of picking through my luggage, and the assurance that what he saw there would tell him what he needed to know, with or without my assistance. I imagined there would be some pleasure in such scrutiny, like looking into a room before it has been prepared for viewing, before its truthful ordinariness has been transformed into a kind of spectacle. I imagine there would be pleasure too in having an assured grasp of the secret codes that reveal what people seek to hide, a hermeneutics of baggage that is like following an archaeological trail or examining lines on a shipping map. I kept quiet, matching my breathing to his, so that I should feel the approach of annoyance in him. "Reason for seeking entry into the United Kingdom? Are you a tourist? On holiday? Any funds? Do you have any money, sir? Traveller's checks, sterling, dollars? Do you know anybody who can offer a guarantee? Any contact address? Was there someone you were hoping to stay with while you were in the UK? Oh, bloody hell, bloody stupid hell. Do you have family in the UK? Do you speak any English, sir? I'm afraid your documents are not in order, sir, and I will have to refuse you permission to enter, unless you can tell me something about your circumstances. Do you have any documentation that might help me understand your circumstances? Papers? Do you have any papers?" He left the room, and I sat calmly and still, suppressing a sigh of relief, and counted backwards from 145, which was where I had got to while he was talking to me. I restrained myself from leaning forward to inspect his pad, in case he had seen through my dumb silence. But I suspected someone would be peering at me through a spy hole, watching for just such an incriminating move. It must have been the drama of the moment that made me think that. As if anyone could have cared whether I was picking my nose or secreting diamonds up my ass. Sooner or later they would get to know all they needed to know. They had machines for all that. I had been warned, and their officials had been trained at great expense to see through the lies people like me told, and in addition they had great and frequent experience. So I sat still and counted quietly, shutting my eyes now and then to suggest distress, reflection, and a trace of resignation. "Do with me that you will, oh Kevin." He returned with the small green cloth bag I had brought as my luggage, and put the bag on the bench. "Would you mind opening this, please?" he said. I looked agitated and uncomprehending, I hoped, and waited for him to elaborate. He glared at me and pointed at the bag, so with smiles of relief and understanding, and placating nods, I got up to unzip the bag. He took one item out at a time, laying each one out carefully on the bench, as if he was unpacking clothing of some delicacy. 2 shirts, 1 blue, 1 yellow, both faded. 3 white shirts, 1 pair of brown trousers, 3 pairs of underpants, 2 pairs of socks, 1 kanzu, 2 saronese, a towel, and a small wooden casket. He sighed when he came to the last item, turning it round in his hand with interest and then sniffing it. "Mahogany?" he asked. I said nothing, of course, touched for the moment by the paltry mementos of a life spread out on the bench in that airless room. It was not my life that lay spread there, just what I had selected as signals of a story I hoped to convey. Kevin Edelman opened the casket and started with surprise at its contents. Perhaps he expected jewelry or something valuable. Drugs. "What's this?" he asked, then carefully sniffed the open casket. It was hardly necessary, as the little room had filled with glorious perfume as soon as he opened the box. "Incense," he said. "It is, isn't it?" He shut the casket and put it down on the bench, his tired eyes sparkling with amusement. Interesting booty from the reeking heat of some bazaar. I sat down on the chair as he instructed me, and waited while he went back to the bench with his pad and noted down the grubby items he had laid out there. He went on writing for a moment longer after he came back to the table, having now filled 2 or 3 pages of his notepad. Then he put his pen down and leaned back, wincing slightly as the back of the chair bit into his weary shoulder blades. He looked pleased with himself, almost cheerful. I could see he was about to pronounce sentence, and I could not suppress a surge of depression and panic. "Mr. Charbon, I don't know anything about the reason that brought you here, all the expenses you incurred and all that, so I'm sorry for what I now have to do. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to refuse you entry into the United Kingdom. You don't have a valid entry visa, you have no funds, and you have no one who can offer a guarantee for you. I don't suppose you can understand what I'm saying, but I have to tell you this anyway before I stamp your passport. Once I stamp your passport as having been refused entry, it means that next time you attempt to enter the UK, you will automatically be turned away. Unless your papers are in order, of course. Did you understand what I just said? No, I didn't think so. I'm sorry about this, but we have to go through these formalities nonetheless. We'll try and find someone who speaks your language so that they can explain it all to you later. In the meantime, we will be putting you on the next available flight back to the destination you came from and on the airline that brought you here." With that, he leafed through my passport, looking for a clean page, and then picked up the little stamp he had placed on the table when he first came back. "Refugee," I said. "Asylum." He looked up, and I dropped my eyes. His were angry. "So you do speak English," he said. "Mr. Charbon, you've been taking the piss." "Refugee," I repeated. "Asylum." I glanced up as I said this, and started to say it a third time, but Kevin Edelman interrupted me. His face had gone slightly darker, and his breathing had changed, had become less easy to match. He breathed deeply twice, making a visible effort to control himself, when what he would really have liked to do was to pull a lever and have the floor beneath me open into an airy and bottomless drop. I know. I have wished the same myself on many occasions in my earlier life. "Mr. Charbon, do you speak English?" he asked, his voice mellowing again, but this time more sweaty than oily, officially soft-spoken now, laboring. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I was catching up with his breathing again. "Refugee," I said, pointing at my chest. "Asylum." He grinned at me as if I was persecuting him, giving me a long look which I returned this time, smiling back. He sighed wearily. Then he shook his head slowly and chuckled, perhaps amused by my uncomprehending smile. His manner made me feel that I was a tiresome and stupid prisoner he was interrogating, who had just momentarily frustrated him in some petty word play. I reminded myself needlessly to watch out for a surprise attack. Needlessly, because his options were many and I had only one. To make sure that Kevin Edelman did not become angry and contemplate something brutal. It must have been the tiny room and the courtesy with which he was speaking to me that made me feel I was a prisoner, when both he and I knew that I was trying to get in and he was trying to keep me out. Warily, he leafed through my passport, and I felt again that I was a tiresome nuisance, causing reasonable people needless trouble and inconvenience. Then he left me in the room again while he went to consult and check. I knew he would find that the British government had decided, for reasons which are still not completely clear to me even now, that people who came from where I did were eligible for asylum if they claimed that their lives were in danger. The British wanted to make the point to an international audience that it regarded our government as dangerous to its own citizens, something both they and everyone else has known for a long time. But times had changed, and now every puffed-up member of the international community had to show that it was taking no more nonsense from the unruly and eternally bickering rabble that teem in those parched savannas. Enough was enough. What did our government do that was worse than the evils it had done before? It rigged an election, falsifying the figures in front of international observers, whereas before it had only gold, raped, killed, or otherwise degraded its citizens. For this delinquent behavior, the British government granted asylum to anyone who claimed their lives were in danger. It was a cheap way of showing stern disapproval, and there weren't too many of us, being only a small island of relatively poor people, only a few of whom would be able to find the fare. Several dozen young people did manage to raise the fare, forcing parents and relatives to give up their secret hoards or borrow. And sure enough, when they arrived in London, they were admitted as asylum seekers in fear of their lives. I, too, was in fear of my life, had been for years, though only recently had my fear reached the proportions of crisis. So when I heard that the youngsters were allowed in, I decided to make the journey myself. So I knew that Kevin Edelman would return in a few minutes with a different stamp in his hand, and that I would then be on my way to detention or some other place to stay. Unless the British government had changed its mind while I was airborne, had decided that the joke had gone on for too long, which it hadn't, because Kevin Edelman returned after a few minutes, looking wry and amused, also defeated. I could see that he would not after all be putting me back on the plane to where I had come from, that other place where the oppressed managed to survive. For that I was relieved. Mr. Chambon, why do you want to do this? A man of your age? He said, sitting down clumsily and looking sad and furrowed with concern, then leaning against the back of the chair and working his shoulders slowly. How much danger is your life really in? Do you realize what you're doing? Whoever persuaded you to do this is not doing you any favors, let me tell you that. You don't even speak the language, and you probably never will. It's very rare for old people to learn a new language. Did you know that? It may take years to sort out your application, and then you may be sent back anyway. No one will give you a job. You'll be lonely and miserable and poor, and when you fall ill, there'll be no one here to look after you. Why didn't you stay in your own country, where you could grow old in peace? This is a young man's game, this asylum business, because it is really just looking for jobs and prosperity in Europe and all that, isn't it? There's nothing moral in it, just greed. No fear of life and safety, just greed, Mr. Shaban. A man of your age should know better. At what age are you supposed not to be afraid for your life, or not to want to live without fear? How did he know that my life was in any less danger than those young men they let in? And why was it immoral to want to live better and in safety? Why was that greed or a game? I was touched by his concern, though, and wished I could break my silence and tell him not to worry. I was not born yesterday. I knew how to look after myself. Please stamp that passport, kind sir, and send me away to some safe place of detention. I dropped my eyes in case their alertness should reveal that I understood him. Mr. Shaban, look at yourself, and look at these things you've brought with you, he said, visibly frustrated, holding out his arm towards my worldly possessions. This is all you'll have if you stay here. What do you think you'll find here? Let me tell you something. My parents were refugees from Romania. I would tell you about that if we had more time. But what I mean is, I know something about uprooting yourself and going to live somewhere else. I know about the hardships of being alien and poor, because that is what they went through when they came here. And I know about the rewards. But my parents are European. They have a right. They're part of the family. Mr. Shaban, look at yourself. It saddens me to say this to you, because you won't understand it, and I wish you bloody well did. People like you come pouring in here without any thought of the damage they cause. You don't belong here. You don't value any of the things we value. You haven't paid for them through generations, and we don't want you here. We'll make life hard for you, make you suffer indignities, perhaps even commit violence on you. Mr. Shaban, why do you want to do this? That this too solid flesh should melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. It had been easy to match my breathing to his as he spoke, until the very end, because for most of the time his voice was calm and ordinary, as if he was only reciting regulations. Edelman, was that a German name or a Jewish name? Or a made-up name into a Jew. Anyway, the name of the owner of Europe, who knew its values and had paid for them through generations. But the whole world had paid for Europe's values already, even if a lot of the time it just paid and didn't get to enjoy them. Think of me as one of those objects that Europe took away with her. I thought of saying something like this, but of course I didn't. I was an asylum seeker, in Europe for the first time, in an airport for the first time, though not for the first time under interrogation. I knew the meaning of silence, the danger of words, so I only thought this to myself. Do you remember that endless catalogue of objects that were taken away to Europe because they were too fragile and delicate to be left in the clumsy and careless hands of natives? I'm fragile and precious too, a sacred work, too delicate to be left in the hands of natives. So now you'd better take me too. I joke. As for indignity and violence, I would just have to take my chances on them, though there weren't many places you could go to avoid the first, and the second could come at you out of nowhere. As for someone to look after you when you're old and poorly, better not to put too much hope in that solace. Oh, Kevin, may the rudder of your life stay ever true, and may hail never catch you in the open. May you not lose patience with this supplicant, and may you be kind enough to press that stamp in my joke passport, and let me sniff the values of Europe's generations. Alhamdulillah. My bladder is in urgent need of relief. I didn't even dare say that. Though it was true at the time, silence imposes unexpected discomforts on you. He went on talking, frowning, and shaking his head, but I stopped listening. It's something I taught myself to do over the years, to win a little respite from the blaring lies I had to endure in my earlier life. Instead, I stared dumbly at my passport, reminding Kevin Edelman that this one had got away, so could he put an end to the sport and inscribe? He stopped suddenly, frustrated in his good intention to persuade me to get back on the plane and leave Europe to its rightful owners, and rifled through my passport with the other stamp, the good stamp, held between the fingers of his hand. Then he remembered something, and it made him smile. He went back to my bag and took out the casket, as he had done before. He opened it and sniffed. "What is it?" he asked, his emphasis sterner, frowning at me. "What is it, Mr. Shaban? Is it incense?" He held the casket out towards me, then took a deep sniff and held it out again. "What is it?" he asked, placating. "It smells familiar. It's a kind of incense, isn't it?" Perhaps he was Jewish. I stared back dumbly, then dropped my eyes. I could have told him it was Udi, and we could then have had a pleasant conversation about how it was he remembered the perfume, some ceremony in his youth perhaps, when his parents still expected him to participate in prayers on holy days. But then he wouldn't have stamped my passport, would have wanted to know exactly how my life was in danger in my little bit of parched savannah, might even have had me sent back on the plane in shackles for pretending not to speak English. So I didn't tell him that it was oud al-Qamari, of the best quality. All that remained of a consignment I had acquired more than 30 years ago, and which I could not bear to leave behind when I set out on this journey into a new life. When I looked up again, I saw that he would steal it from me. "We'll have to have this tested," he said, smiling, waiting a long time to see if I understood, and then bringing the casket back to the table with him. He put it down beside him, next to his yellow pad, tugged at his shirt to make himself more comfortable, and went on writing. This was an excerpt from the 2021 Nobel Prize winner, Abdulrazak Gurnah, from his novel By the Sea. Hope you enjoyed that. Ta-da!